people have undertaken their research. This is a craft that takes years and years and years to develop, and to me anyway, it's always fascinating to see the kinds of challenges people have had as they've pursued their questions, and the almost always unique ways that they've overcome the challenges that come with a particular empirical field and type of question. So I look forward to learning much from the three presentations today, and I'll hand over now to Stephanie to usher us through these presentations. Thank you very much, Stephanie.
All good. So welcome everybody to the talks today. We have three presentations of around 10 minutes each with some time for questions after them. So without further ado, we can get started. Our first presentation is going to be Danielle, who will be talking about pluriversal pathways in world language teacher education. So Danielle, over to you.
Hello, thank you. I will share my screen with my slides. And I apologise if I sound a little bit funny. I've got another sinus infection. Okay, so are we all good? We can see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Fantastic. And I'm going to time myself because I feel like I'm going to struggle to keep this in 10 minutes. But thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction. As you mentioned, I'm talking about pluriversal pathways in world languages teacher education. It's something I've been wanting to look into for a long time, but it's really, really tough to get the data for this. So, Stephen, I can definitely talk about some of the difficulties in getting this data if people are interested. And I'd also like to acknowledge the country that I'm presenting from. I'm also on Turrbal or Yagara country here in Mianjin, and I would also like to acknowledge that this has long been a site of teaching and learning. So I also wanted to point out that this research was funded by both GIER and EPS, very tiny research funds, but I think we've been able to do quite a lot with a very small amount of funding. So thank you both for supporting this research. I'll quickly take us through why we did this, how we did it, what we found, and a few thoughts on what's happening next, with the understanding that this is a very redacted version. We've got a paper that I'm hoping to send out very shortly. So what we wanted to understand is how prepared pre-service world language teachers are to decolonize languages in schools. And I apologise that I've got that acronym there, but I will be using it a few times as it's quite a long term to use otherwise. I'd also like to quickly point out what I mean by decolonize and what decoloniality means in language education for this project. And it's really about rupturing some of these enduring concepts, such as native speakerism, as it is tied to comprehensibility and intelligibility. Often in language education, when we hear about those, it's about being comprehensible for a quote unquote mythical native speaker. The same with intelligibility, as well as these ideas that authentic language is related to native speakers. And that's really not relevant for a lot of our learners in the Australian context in schools. We're also hoping to rupture the idea that language is bound to national borders. That's not to discredit the link between language and place, but for many of the languages that are part of our curriculum, they have been entangled in some of these colonial processes where language has been bound to a particular border. And again, that's not relevant when we're teaching Spanish in Australia. We're also hoping to rupture the idea that language is apolitical and ahistorical. We have probably heard a lot about the connection between language and culture, but we're really extending that to politics and history as well here, as well as this idea that in order to have an effective debate around something, it needs to be balanced and bring in all the perspectives, even when some of those might be dangerous or problematic. So we're interested in understanding the extent to which our pre-service world language teachers were exposed to that. Another topic that's come up a lot more in language education is around gender and sexuality, whether that's around gendered language. For instance, when I'm teaching German or Spanish, we have gendered nouns, and students are asking me how they can have non-gender binary language more and more. There's also the issue of gender roles. So that comes up a lot, even though we might be teaching a simple topic like family in Year 7 Spanish, gender roles really do come up a lot. So it's becoming increasingly important for our languages teachers to be able to discuss that. Environmental issues, particularly once we get into the senior years, and it's also one of our cross-curriculum priorities, as well as the idea that we need to maintain objectivity and neutrality in teaching. And that's something many people in the decolonial space would contest. So those are many of the things that we're interested in looking at, and why now. We have seen increasing calls to decolonize curricula, whether specifically in languages or globally, with movements like why is my curriculum white and why isn't my professor black, and things like that from the South African context. We've also seen from version 9 of the curriculum, we still have our cross-curriculum priorities, particularly in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and sustainability. These are things languages teachers need to embed. So we are seeing people that and ways in which I think there are great opportunities to do some of this decolonising work. At the same time, there are a few things that make that a little bit difficult and that I worry a bit for our pre-service teachers that they're up against. For instance, we saw a push for Western democracy and Christian heritage mentioned in a paper last year from the ACARA CEO. I can't find explicit references in the languages curriculum to that, but it's, I guess, a little bit of an underlying current that guides that curriculum as well that seems to be there. And we've also seen some really great research that's quite recent around the fact that when our world languages teachers engage with these topics, they get branded as controversial and taboo. They might end up on the front of the Courier Mail if they engage with this. So I think there is a little bit of fear around engaging with some of these topics as well. So this research is really aiming to map the decolonial pathways that our pre-service world languages have taken in their educational journeys. And that's by looking at what they'd studied before they came into language, the curriculum studies in initial teacher education. For many of them, that was in a master's, but some of them are actually doing it as part of an undergraduate degree as well. How do we do this research? I apologise for this. One of my students who I showed this said, wow, that's a lot of text, but I'll quickly talk you through it. Essentially, what we did was a survey to collect transcripts from pre-service world languages teachers, and that was definitely the hardest part. We managed to get 16, which doesn't sound like a lot, but considering the total number of pre-service world language teachers we have in Australia, I think it's not a bad number. We then conducted a basic document analysis to identify the course descriptions that were in them, and we found 419 distinct course descriptions. From those 419, we removed or excluded 199 of them as they didn't contain anything around decoloniality or language. We then conducted a thematic analysis and found 130 courses that talked about language acquisition. So this is maybe learning vocab and grammar. We found 38 courses that focused on a decolonial topic only. So it might have been like Indigenous history. And then we found 31 that were decoloniality and language. So for instance, we had one student who did Pacifica languages in New Zealand as one of hers that was included in that. When we went to the next stage, we did do a thematic analysis of 69, so of the 31 decoloniality and language courses in relation to themes based on decoloniality, so history, politicizing, intersectional identities and multilingualism. And then we spoke with 5 of the pre-service world language teachers to ask them how confident they felt about actually doing this and what they remembered from their studies. So in relation to their transcripts, the average number of language education or language acquisition courses was sort of where the greatest concentration was. Each of the students had done about 7.5 units of that, which makes sense. In regards to the decoloniality only subjects, we saw about 2.4 per student, and 4 students had done none. So they'd done nothing related to anything with decoloniality in that regard. And then we had the students who had studied decoloniality and language linked courses, and it was much less, but I think the really important thing to note here is, I mean, this is such a tiny number. I think it was like 0.2. The number of students who'd done a decoloniality and language course specific to the language they would be teaching in the future, so in relation to Spanish, was incredibly low. So what that tells us is that whilst many students had done something related to decoloniality, it was quite minimal engagement with it, and it was quite shallow engagement, and it didn't necessarily relate to the language that they would teach. And so it relies on them to make that connection to understand how they might bring that to the classroom in the future. In regards to the course descriptions, I've just included some examples in the paper. We have many, many more, but we did find really great examples of how history was being discussed as non-linear. There was acknowledgement that some of the history that was discussed is imagined, particularly in relation to Latin America, that it was part of military struggles and a global context. We saw really nuanced discussions around politics and how politics could be looked at from quite different angles to what we might typically think about. So one of the students had even talked about, had a course on K-pop and pop culture as part of the politics for what they had studied. We also saw movements like feminism and different religions coming into it as well. We saw intersectional identity, elements of that being discussed, whether it was indigeneity, gender, as well as multiculturalism and diversity. And we also saw acknowledgement that language was quite diverse, so multiple variations of English. We also saw the role of emotion in there and non-human elements that are required for communication too. So in regards to the course descriptions, we thought, again, there was quite a breadth of courses covered, but on average, each student had only done 2.43. And as I mentioned, 5 of them had done none. So not every student had engaged in that. If that was one student's profile, that would be fantastic, but it was all of them collectively. When we spoke to them in interviews to ask, what do you remember about studying and how confident would you feel about doing it? They did mention a number of the topics that we found and said we remember studying gender and politics. One of our participants, Sophia, said her studies were completely Eurocentric in her opinion, and they all said they would be supportive of bringing these themes in, except for one student who did mention that it's something they felt they could support but not necessarily teach. So there was still a bit of reluctance there. A number of them also noted that they thought this was really only for senior students. So they said, I just want to focus on something enjoyable. If it's emotionally harming, I would avoid it. So they thought some of this would be, dangerous, as well as, it would have to be for your year 11 and 12 students because it's quite dark. They also thought they needed to remain neutral. So another reason they might feel a bit nervous about engaging in it is they didn't want to be emotional and have their opinions. Others were also worried about what their admin would be comfortable with. So I think that's a really valid concern as a pre-service or early career teacher. They also relied on the curriculum. So they thought, well, it's taken care of by the curriculum, and largely it's not. So that's a little bit of a concern. So I am running out of time. Food for thought, I guess what I can see as some opportunities going forward are that our pre-service world language teachers really need explicit examples of how to make these connections. And ideally, these would be linked with the curriculum. I think that would give them more confidence for how to do this. And also tips on how to safely present topics that might be considered controversial. I would not want to recommend that they do anything that makes them feel unsafe at school or that their job would be in jeopardy. So finding ways that they would safely be able to do that would be really great, as well as study planning with these decolonial elements in mind. So it is a little bit tricky in that regard because a lot of those units were offered in second and third year. So in order to get students enrolled in them, we do often need higher enrolments in many humanities courses for them to run. Otherwise, they're not run. So hopefully we'll see, I guess, increases in that and some promotion around it, which I think we are, but it is another barrier that we face in that space. That's everything from me. I apologise for going slightly over time. And I just want to acknowledge that Kate Huth and Carla Tapia were the research assistants helping me with that.
Thank you so much, Danielle. That was a really interesting topic and something that I'd not really thought much of before. So I have a couple of questions, but I'm not going to hog the question time. Is there anybody else that has any questions before I ask one of mine? So I can see that Beryl has asked how many researchers are on the team.
Yes, sorry, Beryl. Yes, there were Carla and Kate were assisting with collecting the course descriptions because that did take quite some time. And in terms of the publication that we're working on, there is another academic who's helping with that as well. So that's Rachel Burke. She's going to be coming in as a fourth helping hand for that as well.
Fantastic, thank you. Anybody else?
Hi, can I jump in and ask a question? Sorry, I just put up my hand, but I'll take that back down and try and turn my camera on. I'm multitasking. Oh dear. Thanks for the presentation, Danielle. I was just wondering, as you were talking about colonisation and decoloniality. I guess that sort of that critique and pushback that's been put on it around it being a buzzword that's sort of being hijacked by a lot of non-Indigenous people. And I was wondering if you could, talk, or did this come up? Is it an issue? Is it a concern? Where does it fit within this sort of space?
Yeah, I think it's a really valid concern. And for me, I think when it's being done tokenistically, it's even more of a problem. So it's really hard to show it in here with all the scholars that I'm working with. But one of the main scholars that I use in my work with decolonial theory is Silvia Rivera Kushkikanki, and she's an Indigenous woman from Bolivia. So I think citation practices are a really important part of that, and engaging with Indigenous scholars in that way. Because I primarily write about this in relation to Spanish, it tends to be scholars from that space, but her work, so in the paper, her work is definitely throughout. But I think it is an issue. At the same time, I think when I've spoken with some Indigenous colleagues, they've also mentioned that they need allies in this space. It gets really exhausting to have to keep fighting this fight when I guess it feels so personal. So yeah, perhaps as someone who can have a little bit more distance from it, I hope it can address that. But I think other things that can be done are also, putting your story into what you're writing as well. And that's something that most of my publications and work, I didn't have time for it today, but yeah.
Yeah, I think definitely the things you're pointing to are important. I mean, as academics ourselves, our positionality and our citational practices and those sorts of things are key. I guess I'm wondering, though, in the context of, in-service and pre-service teacher education, people that may not have the time, they're not engaging with citational practices and things like that in the classroom, in the language classroom. So I guess I was more wondering about what the link with, decoloniality in an education setting in that sort of sense might entail, and the work that would be required around that for it not to be engaged with in sort of, that problematic, superficial way that some people have been concerned about.
Yeah, I think that's a big question. And I think our initial teacher programs do a lot of work, will try and do work in that space. But it is really tricky because it's a lot of training and study and learning. But yeah, I think this is a starting point. It's something I'm trying to embed in the languages curriculum course and open students' mind to, and bringing them more reading. But it is a slow process.
Thanks, Danielle. I agree. I think we've got to bring in the language and open up the discussions. I totally agree with that. And I'm sorry if I've taken over a bit more space than I should have. But thanks.
Thanks, Greg.
Excellent. So just so we're keeping to time, I want to thank Danielle for her talk. It was really interesting, and I'll reach out with the questions that I had. But